You know, it's interesting that this debate and question that we're discussing now recalls my time when I actually was a US Senate staffer to John Glenn. And if you remember, this was in the mid-'80s when we talked about competitiveness and the Japanese coming here and superconductivity and so forth. And, you know, there really hasn't been a serious addressing of those questions, and the world has changed. And I think I do look at what's going on in the US economy from a global perspective. I mean, it's very trite to say that we can't make policies in a vacuum, right? From a trade perspective or a foreign investment perspective, I see a couple of different trends. I believe that the TTP is a good idea on balance. As a trade negotiator, I might have done something differently, but you cannot argue, I think, with opening up trade and reducing barriers. The problem is, from a public policy standpoint, and there was an interesting article in the New York Times Magazine 2 Sundays ago about you can identify who the losers of trade policy are, but you can't identify the winners because it's very diffused. And that argument of balancing the benefits and the costs gets lost on the Hill and the executive branch and so forth. And that's terribly important. And I think that the second issue on investment is sort of twofold. One, how welcoming will the US be for foreign investment? Now, on paper, we have a rather open policy. I sat, when I was in the White House, on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, CFIUS, and this was in the early days. Now that process has become much more efficient, but what I worry about is in a change of the executive branch and the Hill, who is breathing down CFIUS's neck, is will the Chinese, other emerging market multinationals are going to invest in the US, and frankly, they may well be part of the answer to hire workers here. And it's a question of how do we have that dispassionate conversation and policy making. And the other leg, I think, has to do with our companies, and this is where I think boards of directors really need to give much more voice. How are we going to compete differently in emerging markets? Emerging markets growth is 2 times, has been for the last decade and a half, twice the rate of advanced country growth. And what's happening is that many US corporations, from the discussions I have with the C-suite, less so with boards, don't understand that their competitors have changed. It's less the case today that Siemens is competing head-to-head against GE. They certainly are. But I can tell you that they are very aligned in figuring out how to team together to compete against the Chinese or the Indians in third country markets. And what's beginning to happen is the multinationals from India, from Brazil, from China are beginning to figure out, hey, you know what? The real growth opportunities are in the emerging markets, our sister markets. And I don't think that many in the C-suite of some of the greatest corporations in this country get that. And I think they need to be educated about the opportunities there, as well as the risks. So, I'm not sure, frankly, given the inertia of the government writ large here, that a lot is going to change. I think the one issue I just want to leave on the table here is the theological position of the Hill, less so the executive branch, of not paying attention to fiscal policy. Our economy has been driven adeptly by monetary policy in the Fed. That is not a long-run solution. And the number one fiscal need, and I'm interested that no one has mentioned this, is infrastructure. In this country, we cannot enhance productivity unless we take care of infrastructure. And it's going to take some series of serious accidents until people come around to realize, and this is could be a very labor-intensive activity. But this is, to me, that is the real Achilles heel of the US economy, is infrastructure.